Roll call. Whoop. Okay. So this is a meeting of the Futures Subcommittee of the Expenditure and Revenue Study Committee at noon on Friday, November 21st. And I guess we'll begin with a roll call. Cliff? Cliff isn't responding. So
Here,
Cliff.
sorry, I had muted myself.
Okay. Sadaf?
Here.
Bernard?
Here.
Val? And Val is not with us, and the chair is present. So we have a quorum. Thank you. And perhaps we could proceed to the minutes that were posted for the meeting on the 17th. Were there any comments or corrections or suggestions around the minutes? I'm not hearing any. I wanted to notice that I did not receive any comments or feedback from our guest presenters, Alexandra and Vikram, which may either mean that they don't have any or they haven't had a chance to read them, but maybe it doesn't matter and we can go ahead as a committee and approve the minutes. So unless there's an objection, I will move the minutes. Can I get a second?
I'll second.
Thank you. So we'll do a roll call on the minutes. There's no further discussion. Sadaf?
Abstain since I wasn't there.
Cliff?
Abstain.
I heard you say abstain. Okay.
Yeah, I wasn't there either.
Right. Val is not with us.
I am, yes.
Oh, I'm sorry. Thank you for joining us.
I'm here for a little bit.
We're just doing the minutes. Val, you have
I approve, yep.
You approve, okay, and Bernard.
Yes.
So I think we have 3 votes in favor and the minutes are considered approved. Thank you. As far as today, I'm very open to members' suggestions, cognizant that we have a full committee meeting at 1:30. But there are really 2 items on the table. The first, I think, was the revised memo prepared by Bernard, which I believe had been posted, and I'm not sure if everyone had a chance to see those or read them. Were there any comments, or do we want to hold off on that item?
Well, I don't have any comments.
Well, I do have a quick question for you, Bernard.
Okay.
No, it's really a procedural question. One of the sections in your memo makes some suggestions about streamlining permit approvals on smaller projects. The idea of perhaps reducing those things that need to be reviewed by both the planning board and the ZBA and so forth. And all of those, I think, were thoughtful and were framed in a way that was careful to assure the rights of abutters and others who might have perspective on a particular applicant. What I wanted to ask you, as a member of the planning board, I served a term there, whether you had socialized this with the planning board itself or the planning board staff.
No, I have not. I've mainly worked with Kara on this particular thing.
Right.
And maybe that's the next step. But
Yeah,
you know,
I'd like-
we're in a short time frame, and I'm doing a lot of other things. So
Right. Well, so I was just going to make a suggestion, which was that I would send it along perhaps to them and indicating that if there were comments, that they would be reviewed, but not necessarily incorporated or something along those lines.
yeah, no, that's a good idea, and that's easy enough to do. I've done this with other departments. I'll just cut and paste and send and say this was proposed item in our report. What do you think about it? Or
Exactly.
what comments? Yeah. Okay.
I think that's a good idea.
Okay.
It seemed as if you had already touched base with some of the other town departments that were involved in some of the things. We discussed the fact that you had at least talked to a member of EDAB, obviously with
Yeah.
Tara and Lincoln. So I'll leave it to you whether there are any other folks which you think are materially affected by what you're suggesting. And
Yeah. Is there anyone else you can think of on the planning board other than the planning board? I mean,
no, I mean,
probably EDAB should get should get everything, or get this
yeah,
for their comment. Yeah.
yeah, I would suggest sending it to them. And I don't know if there's to what degree
Yeah. Okay.
we believe the zoning board of appeal is involved. It seems like they're a more minor element here, but that's all I could think of. Okay.
Yeah. The question is, I guess what I'll do is send it to the chair because I can't send it to everyone.
That's right.
Although, yeah. Okay.
This,
Yeah.
this is Lincoln. Just one other suggestion. I don't know if Dan Bennett and his building department staff may have some input. That's all.
Well, it's a good point.
Regarding, yeah, I think I took out the thing that was relevant to the building department, and that was the waiver of permit fees. And I thought that was
I'm sorry.
something that the
I'm
town.
sorry. I missed that was out. I'm sorry. Yeah.
No,
Okay.
but actually Lincoln makes a point, which is the following. You may or may not be aware that when someone files a plan, the determination of whether it goes to the planning board or anywhere else is made by the building department. So I think it would be a good idea to send it along to Dan and see if he had any reactions. I mean, generally, I think he'd be happy. I think it's just a question of how do we define those rules? But that's, I think, a second step.
Yeah. No, that's good. I'll do that. Having never developed anything here in Brookline, I didn't realize that.
Well, I only know it because I was on the planning board. That's it. Okay. The second item, I think, is to give you a bit of an update on the solar initiative. So first, let me open that topic for our group discussion. There was a fair exchange during the meeting, but two of our members were not present. So I don't know, Cliff and Adolph, whether you had a chance to, I'm sorry, who was not present? Was it, I've forgotten, two members were not there.
Yeah.
I can't remember who.
I wasn't there. I wasn't there.
I wasn't there.
Yeah, so it was Cliff and Sadaf. So the first question would be, since it's been posted to our site, did you have the opportunity to take a look? And did you have any immediate reactions or comments that you wanted to share?
I skimmed it last week when it was sent out, but I'd like to go back and then I can add some comments because now it's been a week or so since I read it. And then as far as Bernard, your updated memo as well, since you asked those questions, Sergio, and respond to it, I haven't read it. I reviewed the packet for this morning, for today, earlier this morning. I don't think it was there, so I'll read that as well and send comments.
Okay.
I've not looked closely at the solar information. As regards to Bernard's memo, and I think Sergio, something you might have talked to me about. I think that we could be more complete. And what struck me was that I didn't get take a lot of recommendations away from the memo. And I think that the committee should be striving to include actual recommendations to suggest to the community at large, and certainly to the select board or school committee as responsible bodies.
So you would like to see what kind of a more of a numbered set of action items? Cliff, is that what you're thinking?
So, I mean, the way the memo reads to me is sort of an explanation of things, right? Of the state of the world, as opposed to, action steps that the committee feels, and whatever that ultimately is, the various administrations of people responsible should be moving towards in order to achieve change and revenue enhancement or efficiencies. There's just not a lot of specificity.
Well, this is something for future. We're off in the future. It's very difficult to be specific because there's nothing specific on the table now except ideas and plans.
Well, I guess I would go a step further than that, to the extent that we can. I'm not suggesting that there be an identified set of special projects at all, but to the extent that there are structural changes that need to happen in order to achieve ideas that are listed in the memo, then we should be making recommendations to that extent. Zoning changes, for example, because if we're just going to talk about ideas for the future, then there's not a lot that we're actually going to be saying to people.
Well, yeah, no, I get that. In a certain sense, we're just trying to give people some background as to why, we can't, snap our fingers and get immediate new revenues. And zoning. I mean, to make recommendations of zonings. I mean, that's way over my head.
Yeah, just an example thrown out, Bernard.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, and I get it. And maybe I can ask Kara if what things are on the table and what things we can suggest be prioritized.
I think Cliff's suggestion may have value, and I share the thought and the concern that he's raising, I think, with the idea of saying, like in the example that we were talking about earlier about the planning board maybe trying to look for ways to streamline, that it'd be kind of what will be structured more as a kind of a directive, asking that the planning board examine that kind of an opportunity. Prior examples of things like this have come up. But what occurred to me were there was this infamous thing about where the signage, which was given and assigned to the purview of the planning board, was taking up a lot of their time, and then eventually it was worked out where more of that was been assigned to staff. Cliff, is that an example of the kind of thing you're talking about of trying to stimulate an agenda around those kinds of questions for the boards and commissions that are responsible for the issue?
Well, yeah, I guess I'm thinking back to the way BFAC, wrote its report, which, raised a lot of issues and then made specific recommendations about how to achieve those issues. And a number of those things were, forward looking. And to the extent that we can even replicate some of that and go back and reinforce some of that, because some of those ideas were, had some value. As it relates to specific boards and commissions, I'm not familiar enough with any of the activities of enough of them to make some of those comments. I certainly could, see talking to EDAB as an example about, okay, if you could start with a clean slate, all right, put aside where we are, what would you do? And then, are there paths to go and achieve that ideal? And write them down, even if they don't happen, because there's a lot of ultimately a political process that certainly thwarts lots of things. There's at least a hard suggestion as to what has to happen in order to achieve some of the things that we're talking about. And I think the more people see that in writing from these types of boards and committees, the greater the opportunity is to actually affect change in time.
Let me throw out an idea, which would be perhaps what we're saying is we're making a recommendation that the select board should be instructing its boards and commissions to, in fact, do what you're suggesting, sharpen their focus and provide a set of recommendations. Does that get at what you're thinking about, Cliff?
It might. I think it, again, I don't have in my mind an idea of all the different boards and commissions you might be thinking about, but it's certainly, for some of them, a good place to start.
And it's all framed within the idea of on one hand, efficiency, reducing staff time and so forth, and on the other hand, looking for revenue enhancement.
Well, yeah, and easing the ability for businesses for to actually work here in Brookline.
Right.
You're taking down trying to minimize some of the impediments that currently exist. And I know that's something that people have been saying for a long time. But I think it's important to just continue to beat that drum as loudly as we can, because people in the community, again, may not understand that there are solutions to some of these issues, and maybe that they will, start being more involved.
Let me ask Bernard. So I was suggesting that the recommendation be really made to the select board, that the select board should be asking its boards and commissions, staff, and whatever to do this. Does that make sense to you, or is that already?
Yeah. And my thinking in putting this together was that this was just a draft that would be sort of massaged as we put together the report of the overall committee.
Good.
In terms of language, in terms of focus, etc. Some of these suggestions I think we can carry out. For example, although I'm not sure that we want to get into this type of detail, but for example, in terms of business regulation, we can talk about the requirements that businesses report to the select board when they change their resident managers and things like that. And we've been talking about that on the select board as questioning whether that's necessary. I'm not sure that I'm not sure I think that is the type of detail this report should go into, but that's one thing that we can think about. And when you get into the details, we're talking about, what forms should or should not be required. What type of approvals should or should not be required, and things like that.
Right, but I
To make
agree
this,
that this is not something the select board would decide, but rather what we're saying here is that we're suggesting that the select board take on this um,
yeah,
outlook.
and,
It's an
and
outlook,
so,
a perspective on the world.
yeah,
And then
yeah.
from you being the executive, finding the way to involve the staff.
Yeah, we can tell the select board that this is important. A lot of this stuff is going on now. It does take time, though. I mean, it's not something that
Understood.
can be
Yeah, but I think
quickly put in place.
Cliff is, I think, correctly suggesting that we might want to sharpen up. How do you do that? Some of it is an outlook, right? It's a point of view. It's a mental point of view of what to keep in front of our thinking as we do things. All right.
It's also the education aspect, to the extent that people read these documents, and I think they do, even though sometimes not much happens with them. If people do take the time to read a document like this, that there's more specificity in something. I think it gives the population things to ponder. It shows the people that their leaders are thinking broadly, as opposed to just saying why we can't do things now. It's sort of like giving that education as to how things are going to move forward, or at least a recommendation as to how they could move forward. I'm not suggesting that we're going to dictate things at all.
Right.
I think if we don't do that, then we lose an opportunity that we should take advantage of.
I think one other thought, and Bernard, I think I sent this to you over email as well. I read the document while everybody was discussing. So it might be useful to include some comparable communities and what things look like for them, right? So if we're saying it takes a really long time to build in Brookline, what are the comparable communities, and what does good look like as a benchmark? That might be useful to include in here, so that as select board and other departments in the town think through this, there's a bar that we're targeting, and that might be a useful way of surfacing. It might be useful to surface what the target should be and what we're actually working towards as a way to nudge in the right direction.
Yeah. Well, okay, that's a little more complicated than it sounds. I mean, I'll ask, Kara if they have some information, but it's a question of comparing apples to apples. Not all towns have the same type of, conditions as Brookline, and if they're able to do something quicker than us, there may be a reason why that we can't replicate. So, I mean, but I'll raise this with Kara and see if she has any data on this. It's not going to be easy, though.
Yeah, I think that's fair. And also I think that I think if you're a developer, you do end up making that kind of decision, right? It's easier to build here versus here. And there might be a way for us to simplify that in a way that creates a little bit more apples to apples. But I acknowledge that especially in this area, there's often it might be harder to get to an apples to apples, but it would be a helpful data point.
Yeah.
Cliff, do you think you might try writing a paragraph that, I don't know, might be the preface to this or the lead into it or something? Is that useful?
What's this?
I'm sorry, the memo we're discussing here, right? We're talking about how how to create an action plan around
Yeah.
these items rather than simply a list or an explanation of, why it's hard to do.
Sorry, go ahead, Bernard.
Wouldn't that be more of a preface to the overall subcommittee report?
Possibly, although I guess my only comment would be that, well, yeah, maybe you're right.
Well,
Maybe in the end,
let's see what.
the whole thing is directed at the select board. Ultimately, that's what we're doing. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, I think so. But let's see what Cliff comes up with. And
Well, yeah, Bernard, I think, well, I'm happy to try, but I think you make a good point, because not everything we talk about as a subcommittee is going to have sort of the same considerations. And having something that covers the entire report is one thing, and then there are going to be sections of that report, because we are splitting things into certain areas, and within each of those subsections there's going to be an introductory paragraph that will refer back to something in the beginning of the report, but then be more specific for that subtopic. And I'm happy to give a shot on this subtopic at this point. I think the other one, the broader one, probably needs to wait until we've finished all the subs, as opposed to.
Yeah, I get it. I see Lincoln.
Thank you. I just wanted to suggest, as the subcommittee's thinking about the business regulation, and just to have a difference, a distinction between the land regulation and the development of the development of properties, whether it's industrial or commercial or residential. And as opposed to business regulation, like, for example, liquor licenses and doing business as certificates with the town clerk's office. Because I think there's an important distinction there. I'm not a zoning expert, but I know anecdotally from speaking with Kara and others that, there are a whole host of reasons why it might be difficult to develop, to have a residential commercial development in town based, we have a very complex zoning schema in Brookline as compared with other municipalities, relative interest rates, et cetera, versus the more sort of distinct issue of business licensing, like, for example, victualler licenses. And so I just sort of wanted to suggest that distinction, and I think it's an important one. That's all.
No, that is important. I should have made that distinction in preparing this.
Well, I think you've heard a couple of suggestions, Bernard. As you pointed out, this is a draft. It's a moving and living document. Do you want to, with Cliff's help, take a shot at a revision and picking up on some of Lincoln's suggestions?
Send me what you have. I'm leaving the country tomorrow, so I'll try to put together something in terms of, or I'll try to communicate with EDAB and Planning Board and others today.
Okay.
But and I have a list. Looks like about 7 things that I need to incorporate. So we'll do that.
Where are you going?
Mexico.
Good for you.
Assuming that the country is not invaded by the United States before I get there.
Well,
there was a little incident on the border.
I think it might have been a risk, but I'm not sure about Mexico.
Well, no, there was an incident a couple of days ago where the U.S. military put up signs telling people to stay out because it's a military zone or something. And these signs were put in on Mexican territory because they didn't know where the borderline was. Right? sort of Keystone Cops type of situation. I'm sure it's not going to be a problem, but it's just kind of funny.
All right. I was going to ask Val if she had any comments on this, but she has, I think, left the meeting as she had warned that she needed to do. Okay. Unless there's anything else on this topic, I'm going to move to the solar topic for a moment, I wanted to bring you up to date on where the solar working group is. I got a communication yesterday and today that they are first meeting on Monday as the solar working group to pull together what they are hoping would become their sort of presentation package to the Expenditure and Revenue Study Committee, whether that should be to us at Futures or whether, as we had discussed last time, I might want to include the town subcommittee as well, because some of these actions appear near term. I remind you that town administrator on that last presentation had made the recommendation that the sustainability director and Zia perhaps want to come to the select board in the very near term with a package of information, a plan, if you will. And I think Chaz was pointing to the idea of engaging a consultant for the purpose of vetting independently the suitability and viability of the plan prior to then actually getting into anything more concrete like funding or things of that nature in terms of capital. And I'm not sure that all of you were aware of this or heard this, but I wanted to highlight it because the analogy I think that Chaz was pointing to was that when you're looking at a complicated problem, and his analogy was the MBTA Communities Act rezoning, where indeed the town hired a consultant to help clarify, and I think Chaz felt that that was a successful and helpful step. And I do know that the sustainability team and ZIAB had all along had a similar plan in mind, namely that their next step would be to probably seek some funding for a consultant to carry out the function that Chaz described. And their problem is they have no funds at this time. Chaz suggested that there may be some discretionary opportunities from the select board if the select board came to view this as an item that was of significant priority. And he particularly pointed, I think, to the idea that the CIP is ultimately intended to reflect the priorities of the select board. So decisions about what gets priority in the CIP and what does not, ultimately, he suggested came from there. So that appears to be the first update that I have, and want to get some feedback on that from you in a moment. But the second piece of information is that they are working on the, I think, fundamental concept that this is part of the CARP response of the town of Brookline. That's the Climate Action Resiliency Plan, which I think all of you are aware of, which is a 10-year plan which involves a specific goal of carbon reduction by, I think it's the intention is something like 60% reduction in the next 10 years. And to that point, one of the things that I found most intriguing in the presentation was that they were pointing to the fact that every solar panel actually has an equivalency in the number of trees that are essentially saved, if you want to use that term, or that the panels reduce the carbon footprint of the town quite significantly. And this tree question is critical because we know that in some cases a solar installation may require the removal of some of the tree canopy. So the question is this a trade-off that we're making, which is negative, neutral, or positive? And they are trying to come up with definitive, independent information on that point. So I've been chatting away here. I will now be quiet and ask for others to chime in.
Are you aware that Wellesley has its own power generation?
There are a number of communities that have independent municipal power. Belmont is another one. So the short answer is I am.
How do they accomplish that?
Well, first of all, I would just point out that it has some very significant liabilities. Let me give you an example. Belmont, for example, cannot participate in the Mass Save program. Therefore, they're unable to offer any of their citizens the opportunities provided by Mass Save, whether it's free energy audits, whether it's rebates, or anything like that. I'm not familiar with whether Wellesley found a way around it, but I'm guessing that they haven't. The second problem I'm aware of is that these smaller municipalities are competing in the marketplace for the purchase of electricity. And because they are small and independent, they are been shown to have less leverage in the marketplace. Brookline, I think, has had a very good track record of being able to negotiate favorable pricing. We know that Charlie Simmons, for example, has succeeded in doing that for a piece of the municipal buildings, primarily the schools, where he's locked in a rate for a couple of years that's very favorable. And that kind of ability to negotiate is enhanced by the fact that we're served by Eversource and National Grid, while a Belmont and a Wellesley are not. Maybe that was more than you wanted.
I had a conversation with an electrician yesterday who came to our house to talk about upgrading our electricity. And his comments were interesting. And I guess it really comes back to, what do the citizens of Wellesley see as their rates and options relative to what happens in Brookline? I'm just kind of curious.
Do they
have any information on that?
I don't.
Yeah.
I see Lincoln.
do you know? Does Wellesley have its own power plant, or what type of system do they have?
That's a good question, Bernard. And that's sort of the first question I asked. It sounded to me like they were producing a fair amount of their own electricity, and that might have been through solar or something else. But your question is the appropriate one.
Yeah, I mean, my guess is that this goes back many years when municipal-owned power plants were the rage, and they probably have their own power plants that sort of predate sustainable energy concepts.
Well, this certainly, the Wellesley example would be the kind of thing that I would suggest that we could ask the Sustainability Division to look into. Alexandra and her team might want to take a look at that and see what.
Yeah.
Lincoln, I see you have your
Yeah,
hand
so
up.
I don't know a lot about it, but I just want to offer a little bit of information that I do know about municipal light plants. So municipal light, I know there's about 50 municipalities in Massachusetts out of the 351 that have their own municipal utilities. And I know, and Wellesley's one of them. I know that anecdotally, I think as a general rule, rate increases are more moderate over time than from private electric, than in municipalities that have NSTAR or other for-profit entities. So I don't know a lot about it. I do know that most of the municipalities that have municipal light plants, they've had them for many decades. I think in most cases the municipality was the first, took it upon themselves to put up the poles 120 years ago, or however long ago it was, and that's the sort of the genesis of it. But just wanted to offer a little bit of information that I did know.
Thank you.
So we could certainly ask Alexandra to take a peek at that question. or unless Lincoln, you think it belongs somewhere else within the town structure?
I would think if the ENRC is going to tackle it, Futures would be the place. We're certainly, unfortunately or unfortunately, there's no way we'll have a municipal light plant up and running in the immediate future. So
No, what I meant was
oh, I'm
that
sorry.
simply that before you get to that point, the first question is to sort of validate whether has any value to the town of Brookline. Is it something that the town should be considering?
Right.
And therefore, before it got to the report, I was trying to get a little bit more.
I understand.
Yeah, and so
I think that's a great. I think Alexandra's probably a great place to start. I'll mention it to her.
okay, all right.
And the question is not whether we put up a power plant, but whether new solar technologies can sort of substitute for a power plant burning coal or gas or whatever, by generating enough power to create our own grid, through I don't know, with battery backup or something.
Yeah, I mean, then the short answer on that, based on the preliminary information that we saw from VCROM, was that at least a substantial portion might be met of the current load. We don't know what the future load is going to be. And they were suggesting the idea of the solar arrays and batteries. But I think we've also come to understand that what's achievable in the near term is going to be less than that. And it doesn't require us to create our own power plant or municipal power system, because anything that's used on site is simply used on site. And most times arrays are unable to meet 100% of the load, and therefore we are connected to the grid. We need to remain connected to the grid for those buildings. And therefore we are relying upon, Eversource or NSTAR or whoever else is our provider. So getting to true independence is, I think, a much more complicated and much more difficult challenge than what this began as, which was, could we reduce our operating budget by producing some of our own power? To which the answer appears to be yes. It's just a question of how quickly, how much, and what do we wish to invest in that kind of an undertaking. That's my take on it anyway.
Makes sense.
Okay, so given that this initiative, and as suggested by Chaz, may actually wind up in front of the select board, maybe even before the end of the year, do we need to bring our town subcommittee up to speed on this? Because in that portion of it is no longer a futures issue as much as potentially immediate. It could even affect FY26. It certainly would be able to impact FY27 budget planning. So I'm really asking, do we need to involve more of our colleagues here on this next round, which I think would be the last round in front of our committees? And after that, it would go directly to the select board, presumably driven by ZEB and the sustainability director.
I think it's okay to include them, but I think given that to date this has been part of the Futures Subcommittee, moving it back and forth given the timeline
Okay.
might be disruptive. But I think it makes sense to invite the town members to the extent that they want to hear more information about it.
Right. And perhaps when they have a cleaned up deck, maybe we just share it with them and let them know when we meet again. Okay, I think that's sensible. Makes sense to me. Anybody have a different take on that? Okay. Now we have a few minutes left. I think the first question would be to Bernard. Knowing that we're going to meet as a full committee at 1:30, is there anything here that we should be doing in preparation for that meeting?
Well, I assume everyone has read Chaz's outline.
Yes,
Yeah, I mean, I would think that people should just think about how our report fits into that outline.
okay,
I mean, and for example, how, from the standpoint of that outline, or some changes that maybe we suggest, um, we introduce, the findings of this subcommittee and make it relevant to the overall report, as well as what this report is for, and that is to advocate for presumably an override.
yeah, I don't know what we're going to recommend because I'm not there
Yeah.
yet on an override, but anyway, okay,
Yeah.
that's
Well,
fine.
I mean, but that is one option. And
Yep.
if we don't ask for an override, then we still have to articulate to the community why we're not asking for an override.
Right, or an override of a different kind. I agree.
Right. Yeah.
Understood. Yeah. Now, I do want to go back to one of the other topics that I've initiated, which is this whole issue of, on one hand, the impacts of inflation, and that has impacts on both our revenue planning, and as I suggested, it also has impacts on our debt service, or at least how we think about it. I've circulated a couple of drafts which have gotten basically either little response or I would even say negative response. And so I'm trying to sound the depths here a little bit to understand whether the issue is more about how the question is framed and written about, or whether the entire subject is essentially not useful or not thought of as being a contribution to the full report.
So Sergio, I apologize. I missed the beginning of what you said. Is this on the inflation piece or?
Yes. The question was that I have introduced this question
Right.
and pointed to two areas where it might have some impacts. One is on how we plan on revenue projection,
Mhm.
and the other is on how we view the debt burden that we carry.
Yeah.
And the drafts that I tried a couple of times had either not met with any comment, or what little comment suggested that maybe that this was not useful or not relevant to the work that we're doing. And I was trying to understand whether it's a question of how it's written, that's the topic is good, but the write-up is bad, or whether the entire topic is really not contributing to the basics of what we as a committee are trying to do.
Yeah. And I believe I sent you some comments. I think that the write-up is useful, and then I think the conclusion depends on where we land as a committee. Uh, but I think it is helpful to make sure that everybody understands what this means for our purchasing power over time. And then to the extent that we are recommending an override that helps in context, or to the extent that we're not, I think it needs to be, it needs to effectively dovetail into what the ultimate recommendation is or is not.
Okay, rather than being kind of floating out there as a,
That is my point of view.
yeah, got it. All right. Go ahead, Cliff.
Yeah, I question its utility. And maybe I'm just being, too nitpicky. Again, I don't see any recommendation associated with it. I am not sure that using the CPI is the appropriate measure for what happens to a government, because the CPI is a basket of goods that the government isn't necessarily purchasing. And maybe it's the way it's written, but again, I don't understand how it gets woven into what we're talking about at all. And what flows from it in terms of a recommendation or guidance to anyone.
Well, I mean, if you're suggesting, a specific example, one immediate one would be if you're doing an override that's, say, 3 years, but you're doing the analysis in nominal numbers, then your third year target is going to be off by, some amount, 10% or so. Maybe that's helpful to know and understand.
Well, I think that depends on what happens to inflation, right? And it also depends on what happens to other revenue in the town. You can't make that blanket statement.
Well, I think maybe what I was pointing to is that the override is a defined number, and it's customarily been apportioned over a 3-year period with specific amounts. Am I correct in that statement?
Yes, you are, except that the amounts that first get spent, the override's added to the tax base grows at 2.5%. And generally speaking, the amounts that are put into an override the first year doesn't stay constant. It gets increased as well. I mean, it's not as if you're spending $1 on a good from an override today, that you're only going to be spending $1 on that good the next year. We're only going to have $1 to spend on that good.
I guess I'm not.
Let's go back to world language, okay? World language start off at what, $600,000, whatever it was. Well, it increased by at least 2.5% every year.
But it was not funded by an override.
Yes, it was.
Yeah.
It was. Okay. All right. I stand corrected. Then, so it increased by that. You need to help me understand how that happened. We voted for an override. The override had certain amounts in it. How did the number increase?
Because the override gets added to the tax basis.
Right.
Tax base. It gets
correct.
So when we
so the tax base increased, we agree with that, but the override amount did not.
Yeah, no,
I'm missing something.
But the services that the override paid for are reduced.
You're going to have to help me with this. I'm not following it. Maybe we need to take it offline. We've only got a couple of minutes anyway. Clearly, I'm not following something here.
So let me say it like this. Again, if you think the school's got $500,000 in 2009 for world language, and they only got $500,000 each year after. Let me finish that, because that's all that was in the override. That's not true. Okay, just like when we put more money into roads, on an override, it's not true that money that isn't increased every year, by the 2.5%, or at least it's the opportunity is for it to be increased, and the assumption is that it's going to be increased. At least that's what I've always been told.
Okay, we may not be disagreeing, but I see Lincoln has his hand up. Yes.
But just 2 quick things. So Cliff is correct in how Brookline has traditionally structured its overrides, right? And which is somewhat unusual. But it is traditionally how Brookline has structured the overrides, that the levy, the maximum levy each year for property taxes and personal property for the town is at the prior year's level, plus 2.5%, plus new growth, plus any debt exclusions, and then plus the operating override. And what Brookline has done for the past several anyway, overrides is while the levy technically goes up to the maximum amount, the promise is that the override amount will be phased in over 3 years. But in, for example, the second year of the override, so in the first year of the override, approximately, 1/3, let's say, 1/3 of the entire levy increase that was approved by the voters is added to the levy that is taxed. And then the 2.5% for the next year is applied to that increase. And then on top of that, the second year of the override. So is that your point, Chris? Cliff, is that the 2.5% is applied to reach the new levy, the new tax levy. And just, I know I said it before, but I'll just reiterate from my perspective that the primary value in looking at the inflationary factors is to help acknowledge that Proposition 2.5 doesn't account. Let's just take services discretely and leave out, for example, salary increases and cost of living increases, et cetera. But just taking the price of services that the town purchases, for example, IT, health, certainly health insurance, et cetera. I think all of those things are increasing at more than 2.5%. And that increase has been rising in the last few years. So that helps to indicate from my perspective that in order to have level services, 2.5% doesn't cut it, because inflation is outpacing that 2.5% that's allowed by Proposition 2.5. So to me, it helps to explain the reasoning for why an override might be necessary.
And that was the point that I was trying to make earlier. So I think in context, depending on what the recommendation is, I think that's where, in my opinion, that's where the value is.
Right. Because it's part of the future in that if you assume inflation may continue to rise at a higher rate than 2.5% over many years, but it certainly explains the past and certainly explains the past 3 to 5 years.
Yeah. So I get it. I understand. But let's take the last, the 3.5 or 4 years before that, where inflation was low. Okay. It's not as if costs didn't increase, and it's not as if the taxpayers got a break because the CP.
Cliff?
Cliff, we lost. Oh, your audio cut out, Cliff. After that. It's not as if taxpayers got a break. And that
right. It's not as if revenue is going up by 2.5%, inflation was only going up by 1% or 1.5%. And
I got to get off. Bye.
Okay, thank you. By using inflation, and I totally understand the way this works, but by using inflation as the rationale.
Kristen Rouse, a U.S. Army veteran.
I'm muted, Bernard.
What's going on, Cliff?
What?
We keep losing your audio for some reason.
Oh, okay.
Can hear you now.
One of the things it undercuts is the need for agencies, because you can reach the conclusion the only reason we need more.
You keep cutting out, Cliff.
I think the thesis of what Cliff is saying is that by using inflation, then it doesn't sufficiently surface that we still need to look at efficiencies. Is that a good headline? Okay, all right. That's what I gleaned from the cutting in and out. I think
But
that's fair, but I don't think that surfacing the reality of the inflationary environment means that we can't also say that part of how we manage that is through efficiencies, or that there's a baseline need for efficiencies regardless, because that's just good business or good management, right? Fiscal management. So I think we can. I actually think this is in depending on how we write this. I think you can actually. I mean, it's sort of laying out the facts, right? So I see your point, Cliff, but I don't know that it has to be written in a way that actually minimizes the need for efficiencies, and both because we need to be able to balance and counteract the increase in costs, and because it's unsustainable from a tax point of view, right? Number one, and number two, just because it's good management. So I think we can do both, but I'm happy to, yeah.
That's fine, and I appreciate your comments, really. It's certainly not the way the memo's written, and I think to achieve that, things need to be reworked, because because what we have right now is math, right? I think if we can put it all together, absolutely agree with you.
Well, I have to, I guess, going to need some guidance here, because I really I'm missing something. When you suggested earlier, Cliff, that there's been periods recently when inflation was very low. Indeed, it's been even briefly negative. You're correct. But it has a very profound effect on the town. It means that we're able to purchase more for whatever we had budgeted. And so it's a benefit. And conversely, when inflation's high, on the purchase side, we're hurt, but on the debtor side, we benefit.
I don't buy that one.
Why not?
Because you're, at the end of the day, it's not like an ongoing business. Okay, you're looking at the taxpayers, and the taxpayers today are different than the taxpayers 22 years from now. And
We lost you. Cannot hear you, Cliff. I don't know why. He's muted now.
yeah,
Okay, got you now.
Yeah.
So you're saying that there are different taxpayers over time. Yes, we agree. But those future taxpayers are still the beneficiaries of a reduced debt load. Still breaking up, unfortunately, Cliff.
Do you want to try?
I'm not saying anything. I'm not saying anything.
Oh, okay. Sorry.
That's just Cliff being frustrated. Do you want to try dialing on your phone? That might work better.
I'm going to try switching.
Use your microphone. It sounds like it's your microphone.
What I'm saying is that I understand and appreciate the math, okay? What I'm saying is that you can't evaluate the burden on someone 22 years from now who may be completely different than the individual today. And the money that they're making, because it's the taxpayer that's paying, it's not actually the town that's paying. And so you talk about it as if it's a as if it's money coming from the town. I don't view it that way. I view it as money coming from the taxpayers.
I would agree with that.
And I guess I just don't, I'm having a hard time grasping what it is we're trying to tell people who are paying today about what people are going to be paying 25 years from now or 20 years from now, when most likely a lot of these people aren't going to be here.
Okay.
I don't get the utility of having that conversation, because if you take it to its extreme, what you're really saying is we should borrow everything.
When you say borrow everything, I'm not quite
We
following.
should maximize debt.
Well,
And we should, push out principal. If we could do bullet loans, we should do bullet loans.
I'm sorry, a bullet loan is one that has the entire principal due at the end.
Yeah, although legally we can't, but if we could, that's what you're suggesting.
If the question is asked in terms of there are two parts to your question. The first is you're suggesting that I'm saying that everything ought to be debt. No, I don't think so, because there is a real cost associated with that. And you can save that real cost by using your current dollars. So I'm not suggesting that the current taxpayer shouldn't pay. And on the question of pushing the debt to the future, I think you actually could make a very good argument for that, with the provision that such a debt instrument places a significant risk on the lender, and therefore is customarily associated with a much higher interest rate. So the question you may want to ask is there any reason to ever change a debt instrument to be anything other than how do you minimize the total cost to the town? So this idea of pushing debt to the future, which came apparently out of the 2015 override committee, may have a valid rationale of saying, hey, those future taxpayers should be participants. But as I've shown you, when you actually graph it in real terms, the effect is very tiny on the future participant, and the effect on the town is significant. That is, the total cost is greater. So why do it? These are perhaps too arcane discussions and fine points. And as I said at the beginning, I'm not trying to railroad this committee around this issue. And I'm happy to be guided. And what I'm hearing is that the focus really wants to be on, I'm not sure how you got to the conclusion that the focus out of this is on efficiency. I would argue that that's true at all times, regardless. It's not a corollary of this conversation in my mind. So we've been at this a while. Maybe we all want a break before our next meeting. So I'm happy to take a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
All in favor? Thank you, guys. And we'll see each other in 15, 20 minutes. Thanks.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.